Debrief, everybody. Day 2 in the retrial of a man accused of murdering a mother and her 3 children. Prosecutors say Henry Segura is the one who killed in 2010 his girlfriend Brandy Peters, their 3-year-old child, and Peters' twin 6-year-old daughters. The motive, they say, was Segura's $20,000 child support debt. Segura says he's innocent and that Peters was the victim of a drug cartel. He says she took $100,000 in drug money and that the cartel left a calling card when it killed her and the children. A jury in Segura's first trial deadlocked after 19 hours of deliberations. The victim's sister describes the last time they spoke. She asked not to have her face shown.
Had to be around 4-ish, sometime in the evening, because I was just getting home from work. I had just pulled up in the yard, just got home, and she came over with my mom. She said they was going to pick the kids up from school.
Okay.
And she had asked me, did I want to ride, and I told her, so no, I'm just getting home, I'm tired, I don't want to go.
So they'd get home between 4 and 5, and then you said eat dinner between 5 and 6?
Yes.
Were you trying to get a hold of her later that night?
Yes, I did. Well, my daughter was crying, because usually my daughter liked to go over there. And I think that was probably around 9-ish or something. I tried to call her or whatever, and she didn't answer the phone. The phone was going to the voicemail. And my mom had called. It had to be around 9-ish, 10, something like that. And she called me and asked me, did I speak with her? And I told her, I said, no, I didn't. I said, I tried to call her phone a few times, and she didn't answer. It's going to the voicemail. And she said the same thing with me. I tried to call in. The phone going to the voicemail.
During opening statements, Segura's defense said Monica Peters told officers she actually spoke to her sister at 10 p.m. the night of the murders. On cross, the defense asked her if she remembered giving the police that particular time.
No, sir. I might have told her. I tried to call her, and when the time when I was writing that statement, I could have probably been passed out of my mind. But I mean, I'm trying to write a statement, and my sister and her kids just being murdered. I just found them murdered in the house. I don't remember recalling telling her, because I know for facts that I didn't talk to her that night. It was no way possible that I could have talked to her that night. So I mean, maybe if I wrote on the paper, maybe it was saying that I spoke with my mom around 10-ish, 9-ish, 10 or something, and I told her that I tried to call her but didn't talk to her. Maybe that was what I was intended to write, and maybe I misinterpreted what I was writing with being overwhelmed and emotional. That could have possibly been the case.
I'm not asking you what you wrote. I'm asking you, do you recall?
No, sir, I don't.
With me tonight are attorneys Gigi Gonzalez in Miami, Brian Wagner in New York, and of course Brian Buckmire here in New York. So Brian Buckmire, the defense was hoping to destroy the state's theory with the sisters' 10 p.m. conversation, the alleged 10 p.m. conversation. Was the plan to knock out the state's timeline actually itself destroyed by what the sister said just right there?
I wouldn't say destroyed. I think they were looking for a home run and maybe at best got to first or second base. It's going to be up to them on summation to kind of bring it home, so to speak.
Gigi Gonzalez, was that testimony a big win for the state? How did you take it?
I'm not sure it was a big win. You know, they brought up this particular witness to establish a timeline. And now it's turning out that that timeline is flawed. She didn't actually talk to her at 10 p.m. She spoke to her mid-afternoon or 5 p.m., excuse me. So, you know, it's not a good, consistent witness for the state, no.
Brian Wagner, you listen to the testimony there. You've got the sister up there. She's back and forth. She's coming up with all of these possible explanations, and the attorney backs up on cross and says, I'm not asking for explanations. I'm just asking you, do you recall the conversation? The witness jumped in with all the explanations. Do we believe the explanations?
No, and as the prosecutor says, what she told him way back when the murders actually happened matters, not so many years later.
It seems to me, though, that it could be a win for the defense, though, because the defense is just asking, do you remember? And instead, Brian Buckmire, the witness is coming up, well, you know, if that's what I told them, that's not what I meant. I may have misinterpreted what I was writing. How do you misinterpret what you're writing?
It's, well, kind of what Brian Wagner is saying, because of the distance in time, the prosecution will try to cure it up by being like, hey, she forgot, but what she said initially was the truth. But as a defense attorney, it could be a win so long as they're capable of carrying the day to say, hey, this is muddled. The timeline that they believe that is so strong and so concrete is actually quicksand or mud at best.
Okay, so again, the burden here, Gigi, is reasonable doubt. Is this enough for the defense to inject at least some reasonable doubt into the state's case?
Yes, absolutely, because it calls into question the timeline of events.
Well, we're going to keep listening to more testimony in this case. Now, Brandy Peters, of course, fought for her life before being shot at least 7 times. That's the testimony. A medical examiner described the injuries that Peters suffered.
There was a large open wound on her forehead and several smaller lacerations. The most severe injury on her whole body was the injury there to her forehead, where it basically was open, where I could see inside her head. This was all crushed in and fractured, and the brain was exposed. The right side of her head, there are several lacerations, and this diagram also shows a gunshot wound there to her right ear. There's also another gunshot wound that I found on the back of her head. All of the gunshot wounds, there were 8 total. She may have been shot 7 times because one, I believe, was a re-entry. There were fractures of 2 fingers on this side, and then a fracture of her middle finger, and the tip of her left little finger was partially amputated.
Are these injuries what you would characterize as defensive type injuries?
We use the term defense type injuries because when someone is fighting off an attacker and they're trying to protect their body, then they'll put their hands up or their arms.
That medical examiner says some of Brandy Peters' head injuries could have been the result of someone beating her with a gun. On cross, we'll skip ahead to that now, the defense questioned whether Peters' injuries could have been caused by something other than a gun.
Looking at the depressed fractures, it would have to be some object that had a roughly round surface for where it would impact the head, and the other somewhat oblong. I can't think of a specific object that would have that shape.
Like the head of a bat?
No, I don't think it was a bat.
What about a ball-peen hammer?
The one, depending on the size of the hammer, the circle was somewhat big, so I can't say for sure for that.
Police found the 3 children stacked on top of one another in the bathtub. The medical examiner here describes the injuries to one of the twin girls, Tamaya, who was just 6 years old.
There is stippling here that you can see around the entry wound.
And so that would tell you that the gun was within a couple of feet from her head?
Yes.
Did you examine Tamaya Peters' stomach contents?
Yes, I did.
And what did you see?
I described it as tan flocculent with partially digested food. There was very little liquid. It was mainly food substance.
And were able to determine a cause of death for Tamaya Peters?
Yes.
And what was it?
She died from the gunshot wound to her head.
The medical examiner then described wounds to twin sister Tanaya Peters. She, of course, was also 6 years old when she was murdered.
She was clad in this outfit. You can see the wrinkling of her hand very prominent and some froth around her nose.
So she had wrinkling on her skin, much like Tamaya, but more wrinkling.
That's correct. This is showing froth in her airway. She did not have any gunshot wounds, leading me to believe that she drowned, because when someone drowns, we can see this frothy material that's in her airway.
So you saw no gunshot wounds on her, no injuries on her, but the froth causes you to believe that she died of drowning?
Yes.
Javante Segura was 3 years old when he died. He was the child of the defendant and the victim, Brandy Peters.
This is showing the same type of frothy material in his airway that Tanaya had in hers.
Did you examine Javante's stomach contents?
Yes, I did.
And what did you see?
He had a smaller amount of food, but he also had some partially digested food in his stomach.
Were you able to determine a cause of death for Javante Segura?
I ruled his cause of death a drowning.
Testimony at this point turned to DNA evidence. Outside the presence of the jury, an expert testified that Henry Segura's DNA was on a bar in the victim's bathtub, but the defense tried to suggest it could have been the DNA of the defendant's son, Javante Segura. Here, the expert fights hard against the defense suggestion that it was the son by naming the numbered alleles that he found in the DNA sample.
The probability is that it's 700 billion times more likely that the data is explained by Brandy Peters, the children, and Henry Segura, rather than 3 untested individuals.
You excluded Javante from your calculations. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Are you saying that he's excluded as a potential contributor to this mixture?
It's difficult to say, but there are instances where Henry Segura explains the missing data that the children and Brandy don't have, and Javante doesn't explain. So it would appear that he's excluded.
Can't we say that it's possible that Javante is still contributing at some at some loci and not at others, or at least that we're not able to see his DNA at other loci?
I think the issue is that in the instance like here, you have a much larger picture to consider. Henry has the 12 and 14. Javante doesn't have a 12, and the 12 is clearly there. So that leaves him out as one of the people who explains the data. Henry has the 12 and 14 that stand apart. Javante has the 11, 14, but not the 12. Mm-hmm. So we have to start creating exceptions at that point.
What do you mean when you say creating exceptions?
Well, you have to start invoking explanations of either dropout or a low level or other things.
Well, you say we have to start invoking dropout, but you've already acknowledged dropout is prevalent throughout the sample. Is that right?
Again, yes, that's true.
But the expert said that that is not the best or the simplest explanation for what he found. Now, that same analyst said during the last trial that he could not determine if other DNA at the scene was that of an alternate suspect. The defense said it was the alternate suspect's DNA. We're waiting to see exactly what becomes of that testimony. Remember, it was outside the presence of the jury for now. So let's go back to our panel of experts. Gigi, Gonzalez, let's talk about the scene here. I am hard pressed to think of a scene that's more brutal than this one. You've got the mother who was beaten. She tried to defend herself. She was shot over and over again. You've got the kids drowned, piled up in the bathtub. What kind of person would do something like this?
Someone with a serious motive, right? Obviously, the person that committed this crime had a huge vendetta against the victim. You know, they shot her or at her 8 times. They struggled throughout the apartment. There's broken nails, turned over pieces of furniture, obvious signs of a huge struggle. And not only that, she was apparently bludgeoned to death, you know, in addition to being shot by the butt of a gun. You know, and then to stack the children's bodies inside of the bathtub in such a way, to me, it tells me that somebody is sending a sign, hey, don't mess with me because look at how violent I can be.
That's exactly what I read from this. Brian Wagner, so we've got a couple of theories here. The state is saying that it's this defendant who was involved in a relationship with the mother and was the father to one of the victims. And they're saying it's $20,000 in child support. Is that enough of a hardcore motive here for this level of brutality?
I certainly don't think so. And I think the level of brutality lends itself to it being a gangland murder. For example, moving the bodies. You have to be comfortable enough with deceased to actually pick them up and move them into the bathtub.
Yeah, I mean, and you also have the evidence that there's drowning. That's what the medical examiner said. So you've got that level of brutality piled in here as well, too. Brian Buckmire, do you agree with these assessments?
I would agree. The other thing that I would add as well is if Henry Segura truly committed this crime and he hates the mother of his children and these 2 twins, I would think that his own flesh and blood would be treated somewhat differently. The fact that his own child is treated the same way as those that are not his children makes me think that the person who committed this crime treated all these children the same rather than differentiating between the 2 groups.
I think that makes a lot of sense here too. Gigi, Gonzalez, one last question here then. Is it possible we're going to see the state present more evidence that there was hatred in this relationship to try to make the theory make sense? Or is that just going to be off limits somehow?
Well, they're going to have to bring up evidence that this, you know, $20,000 was the motivating factor here. Because with everything that's turning up now with the possible cartel affiliation in this case, you know, it's not looking like $20,000 is enough of a motivating factor to violently murder these 4 people.
Well, still ahead tonight here on The Debrief, we're going to take you back to the Segura trial for the defendant's own police interviews, plus updates from the testimony of the state's key witness in the murder trial of a Colorado fiancé. Welcome back, everybody. Ohio authorities have executed a new search warrant in the case of the so-called Pike County massacre, but they aren't saying precisely why. 6 members of the Roden and Gilly families were killed. They had been shot to death at 4 different locations. Sometime later, authorities arrested 6 members of 2 other families. Most await trial, but the charges against Frederica Wagner were dropped by prosecutors when they came to believe that she made an honest mistake about which website she had used to purchase, of all things, bulletproof vests. It's her property that's been searched this week pursuant to those new warrants. The key witness in the Colorado trial of a man accused of beating his fiancée to death last Thanksgiving has described a brutal and bloody killing scene. Patrick Frazee is accused of murdering Kelsey Barrett. Crystal Lee, formerly known as Crystal Kenny, is charged with tampering with Barrett's cell phone. She flipped and testified to cleaning up the murder scene after she says Frazee killed Barrett. Barrett disappeared after this surveillance footage showed her grocery shopping with her baby. Other surveillance footage places Frazee at the crime scene 11 times the day authorities say he killed Barrett. He told police he'd only been there once that day. 7 women and 5 men are on the jury, but remember, cameras, live tweeting, and even a sketch artist are banned from the courtroom at the judge's orders. Lee testified that Frazee called her to clean up after killing Barrett. She said there was blood all over the floor, the walls, on a windowsill, and even on stuffed animals at Barrett's condo. Lee even testified that defendant Patrick Frazee got her pregnant at some point years ago. She says she aborted it and that Frazee basically asked her if she wanted to be a baby killer. Lee further testified that Frazee called Barrett an unstable alcoholic, but Lee said Frazee was the one who was abusive towards his daughter with the victim. We will continue to monitor the testimony in that case. Now back to the Henry Segura trial. Tallahassee police brought Segura in for questioning one day after the 4 murders. He wasn't under arrest, but detectives did read Segura his Miranda rights just to be safe. They asked him when he last saw Brandy Peters.
Maybe Thursday. She sent me a text message Friday. Asking what I was doing, I didn't respond.
She sent you a text, so she sent you a text message yesterday?
Yeah.
And you did not respond? Well, we're going to do everything we can to figure out what happened. Unfortunately, Javante is dead. And it wasn't at the hands of God. It was at the hands of a man or a woman. And that's not supposed to happen. Man doesn't have the right to take another person's life.
How was he killed?
I don't know yet.
10 days later, the police brought Segura in for a second interview. He again denied being at Brandy Peters' house on the day of the killings.
We're doing as much as we possibly can on it, all right? And you're not being truthful about it with us. You're hiding things from us. We know you have a second phone. We know you're talking to other people. Okay, so let's get past that. Okay? Where's that phone now?
I don't have it. I didn't kill Brandy and my kid and her kids.
You were there. Okay?
What did Brandy do to hurt you, to upset you?
Nothing. Just it, nothing.
You
wasn't upset with each other or nothing.
You were there. We have to get past that. Okay? You were there.
I wasn't there.
Okay. You were
Not
there.
Friday. No, I wasn't.
Okay, when were you there?
Wednesday.
Okay. You weren't at home Friday.
Yes, I was.
I'm telling you, you were not at home Friday. You were over at Brandy's on Friday.
To our guests one final time here on the Debrief. Gigi Gonzalez, what did you make of the tones of those interviews? What do you take away from them?
I think that the defendant was very cool, calm, collected, you know, even in the face of serious charges like this. Some may say that, you know, you just found out your kid and baby mama are dead. Why aren't you upset? Well, this interview happened months and months later after the event took place. You know, I think that he tried his best to be cooperative. I thought that, you know, I don't think anyone should ever talk to the cops, but the fact that he was working hard to try to give them some information to work with shows that this defendant didn't feel like he had anything to hide.
Yeah, but Gigi, this wasn't months and months later. It was one day after and then 10 days after. So Brian Buckmire, I noticed a pretty serious shift in tone, though, just looking at the police tactics there. It was clear that the first interview was more informational, perhaps. The second one was more accusatory.
Absolutely. The first interview, they're just trying to collect information, and maybe he might be a suspect, but not a perp in their mind. But the second interview, he's definitely a perp. And at that point in time, I agree with Gigi. That's the time to say, hey, I want my lawyer in unequivocal ways, and then you stop talking, because otherwise, anything you're saying can and will be used against you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to invoke counsel if you want this process to shut down, and you have to be clear, I want my attorney to talk to me first before I answer questions about this particular incident. You almost have to say it exactly that way. So, Brian Wagner, a couple of other facts here. We've got a friend, Calvin Moore, who basically is apparently going to say that Segura had a .32 revolver. They think the murder weapon was a .32 revolver. Apparently this is somehow rare, and apparently prosecutors want to try to use that to tie this defendant to this crime scene. Does that work?
No. There's no ballistic evidence that that's the same gun. A .32 revolver, although rare, isn't the most rare gun ever. It's not a Luger from Germany. It's not enough.
And Gigi Gonzalez, when we're looking at the totality of this case, we've got these accusations that this cartel is involved. We've got people allegedly going to testify this time around who didn't want to testify the first time to try to draw those connections all together in front of a jury. I can't wait for what's going to come next here.
Oh, it's definitely going to be exciting, especially, we have letters from the person who sent out the hit to the victim describing heaven and three little angels. We have two other people that testify, or that are going to testify, that JC is the one that hired them to set out this hit. And there's a lot of really interesting factors here at play. I'm really excited to see how this all turns out.
Yeah, look, it's all going to boil down to the demeanor of these key witnesses on the stand. We get to watch it here at the Law&Crime Network. Thanks a lot to our panelists. Thanks to those of you watching along with us. We'll be back here tomorrow at 5 o'clock for our recap of the day in court. See you then.